Hello, as part of Virtual Apple Week at Saughton Park. This presentation is looking at some of the many factors that can influence us when selecting a fruit tree. I'm Chris Macefield from the Orchard Project, and I'm delighted to be here with some of the friends of Saughton Park and members of the Royal Caledonian Horticultural Society for this apple celebration. When you're thinking which species of variety to select, a good starting point is to ask, what do you like to eat? And what do you consider a tasty fruit? For an apple, do you have a preference to a certain flavour or crunch? Do you like your apples mild and sweet like a russet or tangy like a Cox? In our supermarkets, the choice stocked is at best just a half a dozen varieties, often from outside the UK, and is not reflective of the real choice of apples that is out there. There are 7,000 apple varieties worldwide, and 2,500 of these varieties hail from the UK. So there is choice of flavour and crunch to suit all palates. Beyond the range of eaters or dessert apples, you may be looking for more tart tasting apples, such as cookers or fruit for cider making. The apple in this photo is a bloody ploughman, a Perthshire apple, which is a cooker and can also be used to make cider. The UK does have a rich history of orchards, and there's been in recent years a revival to grow heritage trees. There are to Edinburgh local apples such as James Grieve and Cutler Grieve, both were bred over 100 years ago. Selecting a heritage tree will help celebrate a traditional variety, some of which have become endangered. It is beneficial also that such varieties may be particularly suited to the local climate. Websites like Plants and Apples from Perth or Scottish Fruit Trees have lots of info about Scottish heritage varieties. Along with heritage varieties, there are many modern types that could be considered. Often they have been bred for their taste and flavour, also for their high yield, or their resistance to pest and disease. Some commercial crops will have also been cultivated for their ability to store well. Modern apples varieties like Discovery and Katie that date back to the middle of the 20th century, they do well growing in Edinburgh and have been voted tastiest apple in some community fruit tasting events. Another key factor when selecting your tree is the location where the tree is to be grown. You may have a small garden or plan to grow in a container on a patio, or perhaps you're planning to grow in a community setting with more space to create an orchard. The size of the area will dictate the number of trees, the tree form, and the ultimate size of any tree. Undertaking soil checks or tests can be useful, especially if there's a question mark with possible contamination of heavy metals to the site. Also, identifying the soil's pH is important. The ideal pH for growing most fruits, except the acid-loving blueberries, is around 6.5. Soil checks should also include, has the ground got any drainage issues? Compacted soil will restrict roots and result in less vigorous top growth. And this can result in the tree being more prone to disease. What is the aspect? Is it open and sunny? Such consideration is important when appreciating that fruits like pears and mulberries need full sun, whilst sour cherries or medlars are shade tolerant. If growing your tree in an exposed and windy location, you will likely benefit to plant a windbreak to ensure the trees are less stressed. If a tree is planted into a stressful environment with compacted soil, or if it is grown in a container or there are elemental challenges like the site being exposed and windy, then it's best to consider growing the tree on a semi-vigorous rootstock. When choosing your fruit tree, an important consideration is how big you want the tree to grow. The rootstock, which is the part of the tree below the graft union on the tree trunk, dictates the vigour and ultimately how large the tree is going to grow. If you're growing a freestanding tree, known as a standard, then the table in this slide gives a useful indication of how large a tree is going to grow. A semi-vigorous rootstock will provide a height and diameter of around 4 metres. However, the way you prune a tree is also going to have a significant impact on the height of a tree. This means you can keep the height even lower for easy picking of the fruits by pruning to get the preferred height and form. If the tree to be grown is against a wall or a fence, then this presents a good option to consider a trained form. For example, cordon, espalier, or fan trained. If the wall or fence is a 6 to 7 foot, i.e. 2 metres in height, then best to consider a semi-vigorous rootstock, such as MM106 for apple, Quince A for pear, or St. Julien for plum. Growing a trained form can be useful for helping to maximise space and enable the potential to grow more trees. A related consideration is whether the variety you choose is a spur-bearing or a tip-bearing tree. A spur-bearing tree has blossom and fruits which usually develops on spurs that took 2 years to develop. This is depicted in the sketch here. Good to note that most apple trees are spur-bearing. A tip-bearing tree, in contrast, has blossom and fruits that develop on the tips of branches, as opposed to the spurs. The fruit buds will develop on last year's growth, and an example of a variety would be Bramley seedling. For the trained forms, it is best to avoid growing on tip-bearing, as the pruning regime will likely prune off the fruiting buds. As part of selecting a variety, it is good to consider the seasonal ripening so that you can get a spread of varieties cropping throughout the harvesting period. Different varieties ripen at different times, in a range from August through to November, some of which can be good eaten fresh, whilst others will benefit from being stored and can keep until February. Late season apples usually keep the longest. In addition, traditional cooking apples also keep because they are bred in the days before refrigeration. Cooking pears, unlike cooking apples, really need to be cooked for them to be anywhere near edible. The last column in this slide reflects on the flowering groups of varieties. This relates to when the tree is in flower and important when appreciating the pollination of flowers. And this leads us into the next slide on pollination and fertility. To successfully produce fruit, flowers need pollinating. This is usually done by flying insects such as honeybees, bumblebees, flies, beetles, and wasps. Apple blossom can be pollinated by pollen from other apple trees and crabapple, but importantly, they need to be in flower at the same time. If you live in a suburban area or a village, in most parts of the UK, it is likely there will be apple trees in neighbouring gardens, and therefore you can plant your own apple tree and be fairly confident it will be pollinated. A compatible tree for pollen can be within a 2-mile distance. If you live in a more isolated situation or where the climate is particularly wet or windy, you should consider buying 2 apple trees which can cross-pollinate each other. When searching for pollinating partners, a website like Orange Pippin Fruit Trees can be useful, for they offer a guide to which trees can be grown to ensure successful pollination. There are good self-fertile varieties, for example Red Windsor, but such trees still crop better when nearby a pollinating partner. In other species, such as apricots, peaches, nectarines, and quinces, the rule is the opposite. They are invariably self-fertile, so you can safely plant just one tree. The main challenge to producing a good quality fruit tree in the UK is unsettled weather during the spring, which can damage blossom or discourage pollinating insects. And also the indifferent summers with too little sunlight can impact too. In recent years, the UK is experiencing hotter and drier summers, along with milder and wetter winters, such as the impact of the rising global temperatures. The growing season in the last 30 years has increased by 10%. This means the flowering times are earlier than what we're used to. Although the climate is generally getting warmer, there is also the impact of late spring frosts. For fruit growers, such climatic change is impacting on new growth, with buds and fertilized flowers all being vulnerable to frost damage. Early flowering plums, nectarines, and peaches are particularly susceptible, although all fruit is at risk. Even self-fertile varieties still need the pollen to be transferred from one flower to another, and if bad weather deters pollinating insects, or if temperatures are too cold, then the pollination may be poor and we will get a reduced fruit set. Whilst we tend to think it is lack of sun over the summer that makes it difficult to grow warm climate species such as quince, it is often our wet, cold springs which is the main culprit. The trees listed in this slide are suitable for frost pockets and harsher environments across the country, as they have frost-hardy flowers. With any fruit selection, an expert local nursery can provide advice on what is a good tree to grow for your particular microclimate. While you can purchase and plant fruit trees all throughout the year, the best and most economical time is to buy a fruit tree when it is a bare root sapling. This is over the dormant period between November and March. These trees can be planted whenever the soil is not frozen or overly waterlogged. When planting, always water the tree in and mulch well. Further regular waterings during the growing season for the first 2 years is important to encourage root growth and tree health. Although choosing a fruit variety can feel like there's lots to consider, if you have thought about what type of fruit you like, how large a tree you want to grow, what form the tree is to take, along with what will grow well in your soil, your location, and your microclimate, all these will positively influence on what to choose and grow. It is a good idea to purchase any trees from a nursery that is close as possible to where you live. This means it is likely to be a variety that is well adapted to the conditions of your area. For further top tips on orchard aftercare, check out the advice in the growing guides on the Orchard Project's website. Or any questions, comment below or message me direct at chris@theorchardproject.org.uk.